Oh, and Lisa, do you like a minor edit to your original design?
Yes.
Yeah, that was quality work.
I like the logo right in her hand. She's just slapping you in the face with it.
Shooting it.
Yeah, try to keep it hard to miss. I figure we'll give it to maybe like 601, 602. And then Chris, if you want to start with the first introduction stuff and we'll go from there.
Absolutely.
Your mic has exceptional quality, by the way.
Oh, thanks. It's just a little like $30 headset thing. It's actually kind of fallen apart. I've been getting a lot of use out of it in the last couple of months.
Yeah, I didn't feel like dealing with the mic and the earbud this time. I'm just like, we'll deal with this.
All right, I see it. We're live.
Yeah, 602, you want to get started or?
Yeah, I'm fine. Not getting any younger.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. This is Old Stories, New Ways, the evolution of Indigenous narratives in games. My name is Chris Apple. I am the IT manager for Sparky Pants Studios. We make the Elder Scrolls Legends, the collectible card game.
My name is Lisa Kincaid. I am currently a civil servant for the federal government. I originally grew up in Oklahoma. I am registered Sac and Fox and also of Southern Cheyenne descent. I ended up joining the Marines, and then ended up in Virginia.
And hey folks, my name is Dustin Tye Richardson. I'm the clinical director of Native American Lifelines and also an LCPC, so licensed clinical professional counselor. And I'm also a Blackfeet descendant, so hey. And then so just a little bit with this presentation as a heads up, we do, as much as like video games are a fun topic, an interesting topic, it's a super dynamic, medium. We get into some things that are both, a little dark. We do talk about trauma. We do talk about a lot of horrible historical things that happened, including massacres, sexual assaults. And there is some adult content that does come along with this presentation. Not necessarily like anything graphic, but, we do just want to make sure that folks are informed. And, we do try to give you some warnings as stuff comes up, especially that's specific. So please, if there's anything or any time that you need to excuse yourself, please go ahead and do that. And feel free at any point to do any comments or any questions. Just to start out with, we're going to do a brief poll as I just kind of give a brief overview of the presentation. So first off, oh, you know what, JD, I think you have to do the poll for me. Yeah. Since I'm no longer the host. So if you can just put up with, our first question for folks was just whether or not folks identify as Indigenous, because we just wanted to know our audience a little bit. And you should get a poll, hopefully, in a moment from JD, and if not, we'll figure that one out. There we go. And really, it's just kind of a yes/no question. But the breakdown of the presentation is going to be pretty simple. We're really going to be giving some background just on Native Americans and especially, you know, the current population in the U.S. We're going to be talking actually about Helm's model of acculturation. So a little sciencey, but basically it's a model that looks at how people identify and modulate their culture, especially when it's a dominant culture approaching a non-dominant culture, particularly a minority. Then we're going to be going through games. And then after that, we'll be going through some Q&A. So if you do have questions at any point throughout this presentation, we do have a couple moderators looking at things, both on Facebook and then also through Zoom, if that's how you're joining us. Please feel free to throw your questions up. At any point, we'll try to get through them, and either in the moment or at the very end. So thank you. Keep going. Okay.
Great, it's me. So storytelling in Indigenous culture, storytelling is the backbone of tradition. It serves as a link between the past and present and a way to the future, sharing history, education, humor, and even healing. So predominantly it's been an oral tradition, but different cultures have used weaving, pottery, paintings, and drawings, and always evolving and adapting however necessary to carry on their ways.
So, you know, in terms of gaming, video games are unique for the fact that they allow for a lot more participation in storytelling. They're wonderful for narratives. And, you know, one of our questions as we even thought about this presentation, is actually we've done it a couple of times now, is really looking at when an Indigenous person is playing, you know, a lot of these video games, what are the consequences, what are they seeing? And then also when non-Indigenous people are playing them, what are the consequences and how does it end up being viewed? From the poll, it does look like we have quite a few folks who identify as Indigenous. So again, we'll actually have a question to see whether or not you're happy with the representation of Indigenous folks in video games, but we'll get to that in a little bit. First off, just a couple demographics initially from the CDC. Some of these unfortunately have not been updated because I know some of them are a little bit out of date, but you know, roughly 1.2% of the U.S. population, around 4 million 4 million Americans identify as either Native American or Alaskan Native. Right now, there are actually, I believe, 574 federally recognized tribes. And in terms of just Indigenous language, it's a multitude. It's well over 200 by this, you know, fact sheet, but it's quite a bit more than that. Usually the numbers, you know, in terms of urban Native Americans, so folks not living on reservations vary a little bit, but usually it's at least between around 70 to 78%. So really what that means is more Native Americans are living in urban environments or off reservations than are on. And a lot of times we become an invisible population, so people don't think about that as much. Just in terms of rates of victimization, we really, you know, Native Americans have higher rates for pretty much all the at-risk categories, usually about twice the rate of victimization of African Americans, about 2.5 times that of Caucasians. Compared to the US population, a lot more likely to be in poverty, and then also a lot more likely to be unemployed. So these are old statistics. They're based off of the old census. So as the new census data comes in, we're interested to see what changes. Okay, we start off dark, and again, I apologize for that. It gets better. Stay with me for the games. But basically, you know, one thing I also like to highlight is just the big at-risk factors for Native Americans. So nationally, we have a suicide crisis, really meaning that suicide has been rising as a country, really over almost the last decade. This is actually one of the charts from really the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which is actually part of the CDC. And long story short, you know, a lot more populations are getting attention. A lot more populations are getting recognized as at risk for suicide, you know, whether or not it's older folks, you know, also farmers and folks living in rural environments. What we are still seeing though, and what often isn't given a lot of attention, is the increasing rates for Native American suicide. And it's increasing faster, and it's still higher than any other population in the United States. And so again, we kind of talk about this because we talk about the impacts of some of the representation in the presentation. So all this presentation does is something in therapy we call broaching culture. And really that just means that, You actively discuss, navigate, and look at both your culture and someone else's. And you do it in a way that's, authentic, and really you're coming from a place of trying to understand. And that's what we're trying to do here today. So whether or not you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, and even understanding that people have very, very different definitions of what is Indigenous. We just want you to come, hopefully in a good way, hopefully leave in a good way. And again, if you have questions, concerns, thoughts, please share them, because we'll always be happy to talk. Just Helms White Racial Identity Development Model. So this is an interesting model, and it's kind of poignant for the current time. So basically the model looked at how, essentially white America looked and interpreted race and racial identity, especially when it came with understanding like minorities and understanding systematic racism. The model basically put people in several major steps. So contact, disintegration, reintegration, pseudo-independence, immersion, and autonomy. And just real quick, and don't worry about memorizing these because we'll be touching on them later. Contact, really that first part of Helms's model talks about people just seeing everyone as colorblind. So this is a place where people are, in theory, oblivious to racism. They will say, I'm not racist. Everyone's just human. And this is actually the lowest place that you can be, according to Helms, in terms of understanding like racism and racial identities, as somebody, especially as you're Caucasian. Disintegration is the next piece. And really it's disorientation as people start to understand that there are some nuances, there is something with race, and it usually is marked by a fair bit of like dissonance, and then also just starting to understand like discrimination is an issue. A lot of times I give the example of somebody who might be young in like 3rd grade, and they're just starting to learn about maybe the civil rights movement. They're just understanding that people are different, and sometimes because you're different, you're not treated the same. Reintegration. This is the Eric Cartman or Archie Bunker stage. Long story short, this is actually a point where a lot of people show some overt racism. Usually you get a very positive perspective of your own racial group and an intolerance for others. You may also end up kind of blaming the victim. And this is a very interesting stage because, long story short, it's higher than people who are colorblind, and by a couple steps. This ends up sometimes confusing people, but the important thing is like these folks are acknowledging that race is important. They might be rejecting minority groups, and they may feel that they're entitled to more than them, but again, they're actually acknowledging that there is a difference. And so I usually have that as a fairly optimistic thing when I see like systematic or large-scale racism, that hey, they're moving forward. Pseudo-independence. I really like this piece of art, by the way, but really this really becomes where someone starts to understand that with racism and racial identity, that maybe there's some things that they want to do to resolve it. They really start looking at the people who are close to them and probably start trying to resolve some of their concerns about racism with them first, rather than, going at a whole. But really, they start comparing things based off of their own culture. So you'll look at yourself, you'll start looking at your friends, and you'll really start wondering, both how you are related and how you're different. And you're starting to be more thoughtful about it. Then immersion. Individuals basically start to really make good contact with their identity. So like you really start to become grounded in whatever you feel like you are. And you start really examining issues of privilege, so again, as like a Caucasian person, you really start looking at how much privilege you have and how you're interpreted. And then you also start to seek out other people who have gone through this process as well. So you might go to something, like a Black Lives Matter movement or a meeting or rally, and you'll end up in discussions and explorations about really, with someone else who's in theory to you the same as you are, and try to better understand what you're going through. Then finally, and I always love the medicine wheel in four corners, but autonomy is the final stage. So this is really like an integration. So you become a lot more secure in your own culture, and you start understanding and appreciating and valuing other racial, cultural, ethnic groups. And you're not fearful about it. You're not intimidated. You're not uncomfortable. You appreciate that. And you really integrate yourself and find yourself in a genuine way. So hopefully, you know, we can get everybody through and get to autonomy, but we'll find out. So, glad you guys stuck with me. I appreciate it. I won't go too far into psych, but now we're actually going to be talking about the very first game. And so, you know, I do have a little bit of a content warning because there is, I don't necessarily call it nudity, but like cartoon-esque nudity. And really it's 80s graphic design. The first game that we're going to be talking about is Custer's Revenge, and it does have sexual assault, rape as a key element of the game, just again as a warning. So Custer's Revenge, this was the original graphic for the game, is really based off of playing as a famous cavalry officer, you know, General, well, George Arm Custer. Just in terms of development and release, it was actually originally made for the Atari. It was released back in 1982. Interesting, Mystique, who was the developer, they actually felt like video games were the future of pornographic material. They were primarily an adult, I would say, company, and that's what they primarily produced. Now, the goal of the game was basically to dodge arrows in order to rape a captive Native American woman tied to a pole. Yeah, Native American organizations and women's groups immediately spoke out about the release. And ironically, I found an article back in 2009 about a possible like remake, and I couldn't tell whether or not it was true or not. But either way, even as like something as a throwback, it is pretty horrible. So the game itself focuses on dodging arrows in order to rape a captive Native American woman. Horrible. And if you look at the historical background of the game, it gets even worse. So, you know, a lot of folks know about westward expansion, Manifest Destiny, you know, really the forcible removal of folks from their indigenous lands. And also, you know, Custer is very famous for the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is often discussed as, you know, Custer's Last Stand versus the Battle of Greasy Grass versus a massacre. And long story short, the narratives are so complex that I could spend easily 2 hours just doing a presentation just on Custer. But the first piece of representation for Native American video games is this, you know, very offensive and highly broken, you know, image of somebody who is in theory a former hero, American hero, who's assaulting a Native American woman. Now, the other piece, I won't get too far into Wounded Knee because, again, I could make an entire presentation on that. And Chris is also going to touch on pieces later on in the presentation. But it was committed by Custer's 7th Cavalry 14 years after his death. In terms of historic events that are extremely significant to Native Americans, that is one of them. And again, context. Now, also, I felt remiss in talking about this game without talking about She Loved Her People, who was a Kiowa woman who was with one of her bands, who was actually traveling with her band to, you know, gather peacefully. And unfortunately, her band was attacked by Custer's 7th Cavalry, and they were massacred. There were very few survivors, basically, who were left over. And she eventually made her way with what is likely a group of Cheyenne to the gathering place where all the tribes were just prior to, you know, the battle. After the battle, in theory, she found Custer's dead body and took his saber and actually sliced him, you know, from stomach to nape, because she had found, as she was basically playing dead amongst her family, after, you know, her band was massacred, soldiers cutting open the bellies of pregnant women and pulling out their children. And, you know, I found this paradox of like, you know, this tremendous painful history and this terrible video game and this extraordinary woman, as these, bizarre parallels that happen in between history versus what people create. Just again, touching on a few historical background pieces that happened in the game, two incredibly important things happened just around this game's development. One was the Indian Mineral Development Act, which really, in theory, both protected and in some ways made Native folks more vulnerable to land and resource development. So in 1982, like about 25% of the US's natural and energy resources were on native land. And so nearly all uranium in particular actually lays on basically land that's owned by Native Americans. Long story short, the act was supposed to encourage them to mine it, but it also in some ways pushes them and pushes organizations and companies on tribal lands to take resources. So again, a bit of a paradox. At the same time, there was a very famous case for the Seminole tribe versus the Supreme Court. And really what that upheld is the right for tribes to continue to own casinos and have gambling enterprises, which, a lot of people talk about Indian casinos, and it is one of the several ways that tribes can have some economic independence. So again, in the background of this game, you have some pretty heavy things going on. Now, in terms of just the model, we talked about Custer's Revenge just in terms of contact, because it looks at race as almost not mattering. There's no understanding of, I think, Custer as a person, Native Americans, the history that went into it, in even, women's rights. It's a game that manages to be offensive to everyone. And again, it's interesting because this was the first thing that we could find as a representation of an Indigenous person in a video game. Again, it's heavy, but that's why we felt like we needed to include it. And I'm going to pass it over to Chris.
All right, so we are going to fast forward some 15 years into the 90s and take a look at Turok Dinosaur Hunter. So in this game, you play, In this game, you play as Tal Set, a Saquon warrior who assumes the mantle of Turok. And I had no idea Turok is actually a title. This gentleman's name is Tal Set, and the Saquon are a fictitious Native American tribe. Turok is a time-traveling warrior who protects the barrier between Earth and the Lost Land, a place where time has no meaning. And he fights dinosaurs, and also he fights robot dinosaurs and collects pieces of a powerful artifact to defeat the campaigner, who's the big bad, who wants to rule all of time by tearing down the barrier between the Lost Land and Earth, making himself supreme ruler. And if you didn't realize Turok had such a complex plot, neither did I. Apparently it wasn't much mentioned in the game, but it did get some play in some of the contemporary publications of the time. But the game itself focused mainly on combat. So this is a crazy idea for a game, and I was curious where it came from. And it turns out that before Turok was a video game, Turok was a comic book. Way back in the early to mid 50s, the creators wanted to tell a story about antiquity, about a people from a pre-Columbian era who find the lost land and who get trapped there. And they invented the Saquon people to fill that role. Originally, it was a story about kind of multi-generational survival. So Turok and his family are trapped in the lost land, and they have to pass down their traditions and kind of their methods of survival from generation to generation. And with that, the mantle of Turok passed from father to eldest son. And when they turned this into a game, they did take some creative liberties. They added the time travel piece. They added all sorts of crazy science fiction weapons. And so I wondered why change parts of the story but leave Tal Set's Native American identity intact? What was interesting about that to the creators of the game? And there are lots of possible explanations. There are some contemporary events that might have influenced the decision, some legislation that was going through Congress at the time. But I'd like to take a look at contemporary cinema. So here is what we're seeing appear in movie theaters around this time. So these films all have large budgets. They have lots of marketing. And they really surpass the kind of previous decades films, which were, your characteristic cowboys and Indians, your John Wayne movies. They really go beyond in terms of representation. We see mainstream studios beginning to explore native cultures in more depth. They're doing more research. They're bringing in consultants, actual native consultants, and they're starting to think about historical accuracy when they're depicting their characters. And there is actual interest in having a native protagonist and portraying them as complex protagonists. So in some ways, these films still have some issues. In some ways, they're still about white men. And we might revisit that a little bit later in the panel. But though they're perhaps problematic, there's definitely an appetite to explore these cultures. And I missed my cue to tell you guys about a poll of which of these films you were excited about when they originally hit theaters. So where on the acculturation model does Turok fall then? I put it somewhere between contact and disintegration. You'll recall that contact is a kind of obliviousness to the difference between race and culture. So, we're all humans. I'm colorblind. I don't see color. And disintegration is where where you begin to realize that discrimination might exist. You try to channel these emotions in a positive way, but your understanding of the different cultures is superficial, and so it can lead to problems when you try to make things better. You can actually make things worse. I don't believe that the Turok character is intentionally disparaging, but he's not really representative either. I don't know too many people who looked at this picture and said, yeah, that guy, I totally know what he's going through. I've totally been there. He's kind of removed from any historical context or cultural context. He doesn't bring any aspect of his culture to the game's narrative. And he doesn't bring any of the history of his fictitious people into the game. So in that regard, his portrayal is a little hard to understand. Why choose an indigenous main character if you're not going to do anything with his culture, you're not going to do anything with his history? So you may have noticed that he's got a harebone breastplate here, and I got an iconic piece of Plains tribe regalia. In Talset, as I said, hails from the 19th century when that kind of breastplate was losing popularity because it wasn't effective at stopping a bullet. And if, like me, you were wondering if it would protect Turok from a dinosaur attack, here it is on the front of the box, not protecting Turok from a dinosaur attack. So now perhaps he didn't have time to go get better armor before he got sucked into the Lost Land, except clearly he has, because in this same picture, he's rocking a pair of Levi's. So why didn't he pick up a Kevlar vest when he went to the 21st century to get his combat boots? It's a silly question, but without a good in-game explanation, this character can start to feel like a stereotype. And as a result, what was meant to be inclusion might wind up feeling like ridicule. So somewhere between contact and disintegration is where I put Turok. And I'm going to pass it back to Dustin for our next game.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So the next game that we're going to cover is close to my heart. It was Prey that was launched in 2006. It's a very interesting game, and we're sharing poll results. So just in case you're interested on the results, obviously a lot of people were excited about Pocahontas, and frankly, I remember being very excited as well. It's funny that beat out Smoke Signals. I did not expect that one. But anyway, so
Marketing.
that's true. Disney always wins. But anyway, so with the game itself, Tommy, who's the main protagonist, is a Cherokee mechanic. Don't really know what band, but he's living on a reservation. And if I can get control, he's at a bar with his girlfriend and grandfather when suddenly he's abducted by aliens along with everybody there. I know every time I go to the res, this is a problem. But anyway, so he has to end up fighting his way out. Unfortunately, his grandfather does not make it, but in dying and in the process, he passes along spiritual powers to Tommy, letting him move through walls, evade enemies, and then also giving him like a spiritual red-tailed hawk as, I don't know, an ally, which I very distinctly remember, and my co-panelist did not. So I don't know what that says about my psychology, but yeah. But anyway, this is a very interesting game to talk about, first off, because it had an extremely long development period. It was originally started by Human Head Studios, and then it moved under 3D Realms, and then finally it was published by 2K Games. There are a lot of reasons, I think, for that timeline, but, I think at the end of the day, the developers really wanted to integrate like some type of Cherokee narrative, and they actually had planned an entire series that did so. The entire series never launched. And there was a lot of concern as it passed from one entity to another to whether or not basically gamers could relate to a Cherokee protagonist. There are some mixed cultural issues with the game. There's first off, the people who did most of the voice acting, they were both Plains Cree, different tribe. And also they were the folks who were the primary cultural consultants on the game. But again, these are different tribes. They have different cultures. They have different practices. And then even amongst the Cherokee, you're talking about several different bands. So again, perhaps a step forward. But ironically, as you're talking about a game that's having a hard time negotiating natives and native identity, around the time of its development, in 2000, and this had been going back and forth for a while, Congress finally passed legislation to honor the Navajo Code Talkers. And I think most Americans nowadays do know about Code Talkers and their contributions to World War II. They actually had a lot of contributions to World War I as well, really providing coded information for the U.S. military. It didn't include just the Navajo, it also included the Choctaw, Comanche, Hopi, Navajo, Cherokee. And the hard thing is again, you have this point where you're honoring, and this is also, I think, happening around the same time in the game, of wanting to honor and include Native American narratives and history within the dominant culture. In a paradox, on the same year that the game was released, George W. Bush, the administration, basically proposed eliminating all funding for urban Indian healthcare programs. Full disclosure, again, I work for an urban Indian healthcare organization. That's even who's doing the presentation. I have pretty strong feelings about them cutting funding, especially when you look at the numbers that most people who are Native today, they live off of their reservations. So you're cutting the funding to support the healthcare, which is guaranteed by the federal government due to tribal and treaty obligations to the people who are most vulnerable and to the largest population of people who are most vulnerable. Now, it was heavily fought, and they were able to retain some of the funding, but the federal government still cut the budget by $110 million. And then this was followed, really within the next year, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs budget was cut by another $65 million. And that is a huge amount of money when you talk about Indian country, which is also desperately underfunded. So again, you get a paradox of we want to honor these people, but at the same time, we don't want to support them. So I put this, and we put this really in disintegration. So the ongoing development of this game really is what people go through with disintegration. You can sit in it for a while where you wrestle with what is racism, what does it mean, how do I approach it in a meaningful way? And I think that's why, it passed through so many different places. It was a step forward in terms of video games. It actually had a lot of cool mechanics that you would later see in other games like Portals or just, I would think, even the survival horror first-person shooter. It did try to integrate some native storytelling. It did have a use of, something like Totem. And, even the core gameplay was driven basically by a positive Native American representation, your grandfather. So again, a step forward, imperfect, but in some ways still a step forward. Now passing it off.
So we're going to go on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. There are some sirens coming this way, so I apologize if that interferes with the sound that's coming. I live on a main thoroughfare. The Shadow of the Tomb Raider was the final release that was bringing, I guess in the prequel series, was bringing Lara Croft up to being known as the Tomb Raider. Everybody's pretty familiar with the series and the movies, I'm sure. Control and not mess this up today. All right, so we join action archaeologist Lara Croft in a very beautiful game, as you can see, as she journeys to the hidden Southern America. Sorry, I'm really distracted by the sirens. As she journeys to the hidden South American city of Paititi. Still a beautiful game. Befriends its inhabitants. Fights terrorists that you probably brought. Steals a sacred artifact sort of on purpose, which triggers a cataclysm that she then has to stop, of course, by doing some rituals, narrowly avoiding human sacrifice, and taking it upon herself to save the city from the big bad that she brought. Kalima! Okay, so maybe not that actual part, but fits right into the game. Meanwhile, there were organizations in South America who were publicly denouncing the Peruvian government for failing to protect uncontacted tribes. The deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon affecting local indigenous groups without their consultation for the government's aggressive development. And recently, this has actually been a more current update. In this year, I think in May, they actually did win a lawsuit for several $1 million. So we'll see what that does for them. Back to the wonderful representation. So supposedly there was lots of research involved. They even worked with cultural advisors, but it doesn't specify what advisors they had. Were they academics? It doesn't seem to mention that they were actually tribal members or anybody who were from these indigenous groups. They inadvertently glorified a colonizing protagonist and worldview. They failed to really portray indigenous people as relatable or realistic culture. And it's possible that the initial intent was to portray them as in a more realistic light, but possibly abandoned due to production difficulties. There was a company changeover during the middle of it that developers. And we found that this fell on the model of acculturation in pseudo-independence. So marginalization, the culture is included, but imperfectly or inconsistently represented. It's put on a pedestal one moment and then dragged through the mud the next. It kind of has a white savior problem. The people who've lived in this for generations in the middle of the jungle, the Amazon jungle, nobody helping them, and then suddenly this white European woman shows up and they all need her to do things for them in the game, and only she can do. Like, what will we do without you, Lara? Like, however did we survive this long in the jungle without you here? So it's kind of a wonderful, if you think about it in that light. Is that on me? All right.
All right, so the next game we're going to take a look at is This Land Is My Land. This game came out in early access in 2019, so it's not totally finished yet, but you can get it on Steam. So in this game, you play as the leader of a warrior camp in the 19th century West, repel invaders who are settling your lands, and rally other camps and groups to your cause. And this game probably takes place in 1869 or later based on the firearms and the railroads available in the game. Here is a map of what the West looked like at the time. You can see that the state borders are actually pretty close to what they are today. It's important to note that not all of these are officially states yet. A lot of them are territories. And that's important because they are not beholden to all of the laws that the federal government would otherwise impose on them. They can write their own constitutions and have their own set of laws. All of them were built on land that was once occupied by indigenous people. With the completion of the transcontinental railroads, there is a massive influx of United States settlers heading west. there's a huge demand for land, people trying to establish homesteads and whatnot. Different territories dealt with the local indigenous populations differently, but most territories regarded them as a nuisance to be flushed out or exterminated so that more settlers could claim more land. So they tacitly encouraged violence against the indigenous populations to clear them off the land to make room for settlers heading west. In red on this map are Indian reservations as of 1868. And you can see a huge chunk of land where modern day Oklahoma is that was designated Indian Territory on this map. Rewinding a couple of decades, there's a sort of systemic pattern of disenfranchisement and of pushing indigenous people off their own lands. In 1830 and that decade, President Jackson and Congress decided there was too little land back east to share with any of the indigenous people who had an ancestral claim to it. I read also recently that they discovered gold on Cherokee land, which might be why they wanted to push them off. So they concocted a plan to relocate all these tribes westward, and you can see a number of tribes were displaced: the Cherokee, the Creeks, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminoles. This was a forced relocation, even though it had a treaty, and even though they were granted sort of concessions for undertaking the move. They were told that if they did not sign the treaty, they would be forcefully removed anyway. So each different nation settled for a different compensation package, largely under the threat of violence. So there were a number of different agreements, specifically with the Cherokee Nation. Georgia had threatened to nullify its existing treaty with them, and yet promised them title to equal amounts of land that they would give up in Indian territory, and they would have a perpetual claim to it. So they were, I forget how many square miles they were supposed to give up, but they would have claim to equal amount of land in modern day Oklahoma, and that was supposed to last forever. The fact that modern day Oklahoma is now there tells you that it did not, in fact, last forever. This is, the Cherokee call this the Trail Where the People Cried, and that has been kind of genericized into the Trail of Tears. It was dubious that the US would uphold this promise forever, as I said, even though they'd signed a treaty with the different nations that had been moved. In fact, in the 90-ish years since the Declaration of Independence had been signed, and when the game takes place, the US had signed over 370 treaties with indigenous nations, and they or citizens of the US had subsequently violated all of them. So rather than enforce treaties that they had on the books, the US had a pattern of creating new treaties, threatening to nullify the old ones, or just simply ignoring the old ones, and pushing indigenous territory ever westward until there was none left. Now, indigenous nations of the West had not signed any treaties, but they had been dealing with decades of encroachment of their own. Even before the railroads started bringing settlers westward en masse, they had been dealing with Spanish and American missionaries who had come to set up churches and establishments in their territories. And then one thing I wanted to call out, contrary to the kind of romantic notion of the Old West, these lands were not wild and untamed. And we're not going to really talk about Red Dead Redemption 2, but one of the taglines for that game was, "Go tame the Wild West," relive it as though it were some vast and empty country, and it was not. So this is the starting camp that you get in the game. And the teepees and the general design are historically reasonable. This is a Shoshone encampment in 1870. So it actually does have sort of a genuine attempt at historical accuracy. But what the game never features were these vast cultural and civic centers of the West. This is Acoma Pueblo. It's a small city by today's standards. It has been continuously inhabited for the last 2,000 years. And there are dozens of these kind of cultural and civic centers all throughout the West. And they're just not featured in this game. The game's main concept, that of organizing a broader resistance against encroaching white settlers, does have some basis in history. There were decades of sustained resistance in California by at least half a dozen other nations. Eventually, the US Army came in and put down all of the resistance, but until then, there was decades of kind of guerrilla fighting in defense of their territories. And there's also a historical precedent for kind of charismatic individuals who would create these multi-tribe conglomerates and organize them into a fighting force. Right around the time that this game takes place, an Oglala Lakota named Red Cloud helped to organize a coalition of Plains tribes, and waged a successful campaign against the US military, ultimately forcing the US to vacate some land and renegotiate a treaty that was more in favor of the indigenous nations. So I wanted to talk a little bit about indigenous warfare. It was sometimes customary for a non-violent style of warfare to be preferable. And conflict sometimes had non-violent rules. So it was considered by some to be more honorable if you could run into combat, touch your enemy without yourself being touched, and escape without being harmed. Some cultures called this counting coup. And it was considered, you had more prowess as a warrior if you could do this, and it avoided bloodshed, which in many cases was preferable. Large-scale violence, that is armies fighting armies, was extremely rare, and it was undesirable by many indigenous cultures. So you can imagine the kind of culture shock, the existential threat when these indigenous nations faced a white enemy who preferred to fight from afar, who preferred bloodshed over nonviolence, and who would often fight until their enemies, there was no one left standing. These beliefs might be echoed in the game's karma system. I discovered much too late that killing people lowers your karma score, and if your karma score is too low, the other camps will not join your cause. They will not rally to you. They believe you are a disreputable person, you have caused too much bloodshed, and they don't want to be associated with you. So this is my game after I killed like 80 people, and then I realized that I couldn't proceed because no one liked me anymore. Given all of this, where does this land fall on the acculturation model? Well, I put it at pseudo-independence. And when this game was under development, there were some articles that came out and said, this is Red Dead Redemption 2, but from a native perspective. And this solves a lot of the problems with representation. You know, this is finally a chance for a native story to be told and to be done right. And it turns out this game did not quite live up to all of that hype. So in an interview with the game's lead developer, he said that the game was born of a desire to play as a Native American warrior. And that's good because there's at least some attempt at representation. But this warrior is explicitly pan-indigenous. That is, he represents all tribes, large and small, from all across the United States. So presumably including tribes that weren't really involved in this conflict in this region of the country. There are some problems with representation here. We're obfuscating some of those individual cultures that did fight in the West with every indigenous culture in the country. And of course, individual culture is important to the story of that multi-tribe coalition. It is a story about a bunch of nations who set aside their differences, and who might have been in conflict on and off, and who agreed to unite under a charismatic leader to fight a bigger enemy. And there is more cartoon nudity coming up, just so you are aware. The game definitely makes some attempts at historical accuracy and cultural understanding, but the reasons for this decision aren't clear. It is not clear if we're implementing the karma system because we want to pay homage to the indigenous belief system, or if the developer saw it in Mass Effect and thought it was cool and wanted to put it in his game. The lead developer cites Karl May as an inspiration. Karl May was a 19th century German author. He was famous for popularizing stories about Native Americans in Europe, but often the indigenous people in his stories would take on German archetypes and not native archetypes. So that is to say, they would do things that the German audience would find honorable and entertaining, and not necessarily what a native audience would find honorable or entertaining. For example, and spoiler alert if you're ever going to read Karl May, his main character, Winnetou, upon his death, asks some nearby settlers to sing an Ave Maria for him, and in his final moments, he is quietly dignified by his conversion to Christianity. And here he is, presumably going up to heaven. So this is stuff that a 19th century German audience would have eaten up, but it's not really representative of any native people, any real native people. So the developer might not be fully supportive of Karl May's views. You know, just because Karl May said it doesn't mean the developer agrees with everything. But it does raise that question. How much of Karl May went into this game? One of the quotes that the developer said in his interview was, Native Americans faced a choice of becoming part of the alien civilization or disappearing. And in kind of the message boards and Reddit, some indigenous people have had some problems with this premise because it ignores a whole host of other options that indigenous people did and still do have. So, two big caveats. All the quotes are from a single developer in a years-old interview. So people change. Maybe this developer has changed too as a result of this creative process. And this game is in early access, meaning technically it isn't finished, so the game might change as well, whether as a result of that one developer or others on the team.
All right. So now our final game is going to be Never Alone, which is created and worked with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. So we can get you to do this without the gameplay to go.
Niveaksiarolo upperengit ka tautuktani. Tautugunak tuak sunapayak sa kuminganeksok. Niveaksiarolo iyuliakatingi pisaw laganeksut. Kano ko niya? Ano ko lakpalkanyam dahil na kumanyait ka. Tama nga ikumawak tuaming. Kakarakpam inyo niptaktak. Sumalagula kami ni Beaksiarolo pitingingani. Agalan kakarakpal kanyat sa gabi nga ito. Imenyawrit sa gabi kami sa mga nunamin. Pagkakahuting nunak kami.
So as you can see, it's a puzzle platformer, and you actually get to play as the young Inupiaq girl named Nuna, and that's her Arctic Fox. They kind of team up and set out to find out the source of the eternal blizzard that threatens the survival of everything they've ever known. It's narrated by a master storyteller in the spoken Inupiaq language, which is translated using subtitles as you play the game. It's actually started off with a few languages, but it has since broadened to there are many languages for the subtitles that it's allowed, but within the game, there's actually no spoken English except for some of the things you unlock later. It's inspired by traditional story Kunuksayuka, passed down for thousands of years, as told by Robert Nazareth Cleveland and transcribed by his daughter, Minnie Alichek Gray, and she was the keeper of the story after her father's passing. You unlock cultural insights insight videos throughout game progression, and that share interviews with elders, storytellers, and other members of the Alaska Native community about their culture, values, and of course the amazing Arctic world. You can see some more pictures of the gameplay. And it's only with the aid of the helping spirits that Nuna and the fox have a chance of survival in a land where survival is impossible. Imagine being a little girl with only a little fox trying to make it through anywhere in the wilderness in the Arctic. Nuna and the fox escaped the aurora borealis. And one of the insights that was told, the children were told when they were younger to make sure to put their hoods up when they went outside, because the aurora borealis was made up of children who had died. And at night when they came out, they just wanted to come down and play with you and take your head to play with it like a ball. So you had to keep your hood up when you went outside in the cold at night so they wouldn't do that. So here you can see the Cook Inlet Tribal Council's established Upper One games, and they partner with Eline Media to co-develop and co-publish Never Alone. They actually sought them out in order to generate more revenue, to fund some of the things like their healthcare and a lot of things they might do for their community. So I'm not sure if everybody knows, the Cook Inlet Tribal Council is actually made up of multiple tribes within that region. So it's not just all one tribe. The partnership was to ensure inclusive development between the Alaska Native people and Eline team. So this game, it definitely falls on autonomy. It's come full circle with the direct involvement of the Indigenous people. The use of traditional storytelling as a way to pass on knowledge using a modern medium. The development team collected feedback from community members throughout the process. They actually changed the original story from a boy to a girl, and they had to ask Minnie Gray, since she was the keeper of the story, if that was going to be allowed. And it didn't actually change any of the gameplay or any of the story, the fact that it was a little boy to a little girl. Cultural Insights contributor and Inupiaq elder Fanny Kutuk Akpik discusses near loss of language after being sent to the BIA boarding schools, Bureau of Indian Affairs, if people aren't aware. And for those who might not know what the boarding schools were, it was the way a lot of the children were sent off to, well, I guess the original Kill the Indian, Save the Man was the thought process behind that. And there's some very interesting books that you can read discussing a lot of the horrible history of that. But one of the elders and the insights went to Chilocco Indian School in Oklahoma with 20 others. They were actually bused from Seattle all the way to Oklahoma. Can't even imagine being on a bus that far, and probably didn't have any kind of climate control in it. Chilocco Indian School was actually where my grandmother was sent after her mother had died, and she had described horrible experiences with not being able to speak her native language, and actually lost her language over the years, and she was never able to fully regain and speak it. So a lot of my family further down, we just never regained that language capability. Specific aspects of culture they wanted to come through the game when they made this were survival, interdependence, and resiliency. So interdependence between multiple generations, being able to survive, like you have to know what you're doing in the Arctic, right? In order to survive, it's not going to just happen. And also, of course, the life in the Arctic. Let's see. And here we have Minnie Gray recording the stories that she learned from her father in the Inupiaq culture. The person who's been telling the story the longest is considered to own that story. So she had learned these from her father and was able to share them. So everything about these stories, they had to go back and ask her if they were okay to change anything or even to use them. And here you can see she's with the Eline Media creative director, Sean Best, and being able to play the game after they finally we get some of it finished. And then the young community member at the bottom who was involved with playtesting the game. So she's actually playing the game on the left, and you can see she's cutting up parts of whale. And some of the contemporary events, like how did we get to this point? Like it doesn't exactly like fall in our timeline. Everything else was in order. So a lot of the indigenous people live far away or in isolation, so the impact of our voices is smaller. So around the time, not long before this, around 2014, we really saw the rise of like social media and bringing together all of our voices who are far apart, as many of us are here today, really allowing us to be heard a little more where maybe we couldn't do that before. So this has allowed people to have more of a sense of community, and this was a way for a lot of things to like branch out, and maybe we're heard a little more now with everything that's going on in the world. There was also like the Native Language Immersion Student Achievement Act of 2014, and it would establish a grant to fund Native language educational programs. And it's been introduced multiple times, but it's never been enacted. They still keep trying to introduce it, so it's not a complete failure at this point because they're still trying. And we do have more indigenous people being running for offices in Senate and Congress. So hey, we might have more chances and opportunities. All right.
So if there, thank you for listening. If you all do have any questions, you can throw them in chat, or you can use the QA function in Zoom. I think we'll just hang out a little bit. Yes, and you can respond to the poll if you are happy with the representation of indigenous folks in games. And I think we'll just hang out here for a little bit if folks have questions.
And even also, if you folks are interested in doing any type of volunteer work, one way we are trying to figure out how to reach our Native American youth is actually within virtual worlds. So we are just trying to see if there are any other Native gamers who are out there who would be interested in, mentoring or just helping, some Native youth, and especially the ones living in urban environments who are most at risk, have some good positive influences in gaming communities, which if you are a gamer, you know that sometimes that's hard to find. So yeah. I don't know if we had any questions from Facebook or any other things from Q&A.
Yes, we have a couple of comments from the Facebook live stream.
Sure.
Celeste Swan says, greetings and thank you, Native Lifelines. A top fan from the Native Lifelines Baltimore page, Andrew Tyler, said he's watching from Virginia, and this was very informative, and thank you. And I personally have a question because I'm kind of nerding out right now. Do you know any video games in production right now that represent Native people?
From me, I don't know of anything. The thing I was most interested in was This Is My Land, because it had come out in theory as a not necessarily a reaction to Red Dead, but like a native open world game. And even though it does do a great job visually, I think they don't do as much like consultation. So I really looked hard to find games that were being made, especially by tribes. And there are a few native game developers, but they're mostly doing like a few short 2D or side scroller things basically, rather than I think larger, more meaningful games.
I did see during research there was some developers who were, like you said, a lot of them are, some of them were language related. That seems to be a big theme. It's like trying to get everybody to get their language back has been a struggle. And then there was one that was indigenous futurism, and I'm sure maybe people have heard of Afrofuturism, but it's and it was kind of if we've solved all of the racism with indigenous people and we don't have to worry about anything, it's all of the characters are native, and they are just living their lives doing these stories. So it's a very different view, kind of in the future once we're past this. And they did some funding with some of them that I've seen, and actually women indigenous developers a lot in Canada mostly that I've seen. But things are coming, and it's just a matter of, I guess, once they're there, how we'll hear about them, and you really have to find them. They don't just come across, your Switch, in order to be able to find them a lot of times. If you are looking for something that's kind of very similar to Never Alone Mulaka is on the Switch, and I think it's on other things, but it's from the Turamura, and I'm probably not saying that correctly, but they very similar. The tribe there wanted to create something like that, and you can hear the language spoken kind of in the background, but it kind of has some story that goes through it. But there's not the same narration in the language that you have with Never Alone, but it's very beautiful and it's pretty fun.
That's cool. And then we have a few more questions on just the Q&A, so I'll try to answer some of these live. So the first one is are there other indigenous language games or that are available or are in production? I don't know of any. I don't know about you guys.
I don't know. I know, Lisa, you just said there were some very, very small productions with the aim of teaching the different native languages to people. But I don't know of anything other than Mulaka with kind of a scope like Never Alone.
Right.
Hopefully that changes.
Right, and like I really did have to hunt them down, and a lot of times you would see them in development and maybe not. And maybe they've been in development for a really long time. So it could be a lot of funding issues that people are finding. And then in order to be able to finish them, because I never see, unfortunately, a finished game with a lot of things. So it's whether they just have a small release or just hard to find them, I'm not sure.
There's probably an honorable mention might be games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which did have spoken Quechua in it, I think, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Correct. So there are some...
In Yucatec also.
Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Yeah, so there are some games that, while it's not really the focus, they're still doing their research. They're, bothering to include some spoken indigenous languages.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. We'll go on to the next one. So what about settings like Shadowrun, where native culture is shown in the background, but there are no main characters? For the most part, they are seeing the props to the story, when the tabletop RPG gives agency to native people. I'm trying to remember for Shadowrun. I feel like that's a tabletop RPG, but I'm not positive.
Yes, they make, I think there's a game, like a video game set in that setting, but it's mainly a tabletop.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there are lots of, I feel like there are a lot of games out there where, like, indigenous people are in the background, but there are no main characters. And there aren't really, indigenous protagonists or their, afterthoughts. It reminds me of kind of like, the Lone Ranger in Tonto, where you have, like an NPC who is kind of indigenous, but then not so much. So I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts.
So I recently picked up a new copy of Savage Worlds, which is another tabletop system. And they have a bunch of different settings, and one of their settings is the Weird West. So it's like kind of a science fiction-ish version of the Old West. And there are some folks who certainly look indigenous, and they do have that kind of like cowboys and Indians treatment. And so it's, in a way, it's almost like an aesthetic that these creators kind of draw on. It's like we want someone who looks this way, who wears this specific regalia, but we're going to take it out of its original historical context, and we're just going to use it as like, kind of a palette to paint these fantasy characters, which that can be problematic. But then again, as Lisa, as you said, there's absolutely room for indigenous fantasy, indigenous futurism. So I realize that's kind of a non-answer, but just turning it over in my mind.
No, I think that's fair. So we have another question. So what do you think a game representing urban Native Americans or natives might look like? It's funny because I thought about this as we did this presentation. I thought of like a detective story, primarily because of like growing up in Baltimore. And I think a lot of like urban Native communities like are very intelligent, we're very creative in terms of making sure, that their community was safe and insular as much as possible. So that's what I end up thinking about. I don't know if you guys have any other like thoughts about what an urban game might look like.
You actually mentioned like the detective game, and I think that Indigenous Futurism, the specific game I'm thinking of is actually a detective like noir kind of style. And that, trying to think of what the name of it was, but I've often tried to think, I guess, about just anything urban natives, and we're not represented in a lot of places and almost anything. So it's hard to say a game would be the first place that would happen. But I'd be pretty excited to see what anybody could come up with.
So we've been running this this panel since maybe January, and back then when we were planning for it, I had wondered what it would look like to see maybe a family that lived in suburbia that identified as indigenous, or traced its roots back to indigenous people, but kind of focus it around like a child's perspective, and maybe there's some kind of trauma that causes the child to dissociate and kind of hallucinate, and then you could kind of blur this reality of this child's normal suburban life with like elements from his culture or her culture that he's heard of, sort of legends and stories and mythos, and really blur the two together. I'm just totally spitballing here, but it would that was interesting to me, to kind of take a dramatic approach to it rather than, I want to make a platformer or a shooter or whatever. Like try to take almost a graphic novel approach to it. And then it's sort of aimed at adult players, so you get kind of the parents' perspective of like, how do we help our kid, and what's going on, and the psychologist is this, and we don't know what to do. So I don't know.
Well, as someone who grew up around I grew up in Oklahoma, so I was just surrounded by other indigenous people, not as much as you might think, but I was with family. And then after I left home, and I haven't lived there in like 22 years, so it's been a while, and I have found myself in big cities everywhere feeling very isolated, I guess, as being native, and always being confused with something else. So I would think maybe urban natives in any kind of game is always right. It's going to be kind of a self-discovery, right? Like you're exploring who you are and where you fit in everything and how you relate to things, because I've been asked a lot of questions I never would have thought I'd ask of who I am, or people almost arguing with who I am and who I identify as. So it's been a very interesting journey over my lifetime, and I imagine that would probably be something that a game like that might, or anything that you can tackle, is because other native kids, I know lots of people who are indigenous kids who are mixed as well, who are probably going to feel the same thing, like people are going to tell them they're not when they are. So that might be something that would be, I think, tackled.
Yeah, that's definitely worthwhile. And I think also Warren had a good take on this as well.
What I would love to see as an urban Indian video game is, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the movie Blood Quantum, but like Blood Quantum, the video game, and have like an intertribal group of people coming together to defeat zombies.
I have it on my list to watch. I have not watched it yet.
I haven't seen it yet either.
For those who don't know, Blood Quantum is basically a zombie movie, except the heroes are native. It's quite good, in my opinion, or at least quite enjoyable to me. So, yeah, a Native American-based zombie video game, that would be excellent. We got two more. And then, can you share any examples of native games that are good models to build on? I do like Never Alone just because it really does a good job in integrating everything, and it does it in a meaningful way that adds to the gameplay. Some of the games, like it depends on where you're at. Like, I do enjoy This Land Is My Land, but it's it's an interesting like version of accuracy. So like I know I'll just go and play because you can just go and hunt and just kind of a sandboxy and just ride a horse and hunt buffalo or elk. But I was doing that one day, you know, because again my jobs are stressful, trying to relax, and then I was in an area that was very much mine, where I had, you know, rallied numerous tribes, so I should have been pretty safe. And I just had a group of like 8 cavalry guys ride up on me and kill me instantly. And I was like, what the hell, you know, like this, but there was part of me that's like, this is now historically accurate, you know. There are those pieces where it's like, some of these games have these pieces of representation that are enjoyable, but sometimes, yeah, they also bring you back to reality. So I don't know if you guys have any other games that you would recommend. Yeah.
One of the sites I had read, I guess when they were rating them, one of the like indigenous review pages had mentioned, oh man, now I can't think of it, the one that you play fighting pirates at some point in another game.
Assassin's Creed.
That's the one. Apparently that one actually has a pretty good representation in it. I have not played that, but I've seen some of the other games played. But I guess that one did a good job of actually discussing with the tribes and like people to try to get it right.
Yeah, I have played that game, and it is a good game. So, yeah, and also let us know in the questions or the comments if there are any other games you think that we should include. We just tried to give a snapshot, not to make this a super long presentation. Yeah, Chris, do you have anything else for this question? Because we've got one more.
Sure. Well, Lisa did mention Mulaka earlier, and I still haven't played it, but it looks really cool. And that's another thing really in the vein of Never Alone, where it's people telling digital stories about themselves. So.
Good. And then our very last question, just how did the Cook Inland tribes link up with the developer to tell their story?
They actually did a lot, I guess they did a lot of research and had reached out to multiple developers, kind of interviewing them just to see who they could work best with. So it wasn't, and I know they traveled back and forth for a little while before they finally brought in the developers to, you know, into Alaska. So it was kind of not on accident. It definitely like we're hunting for just the right people to help tell their story that would listen to them and really work with them. And they did a good job during the production of it. But then you get to after everything is released and the developers, the guy who was in the picture with Minnie Gray, apparently would come out and speak as if he was the one who, like, we did this thing, you know, instead of the tribe were the ones who were spearheading all of that and made it come to action, you know, like instead the white guy stood and took credit for everything as they do. So good relationship, working relationship through apparently majority of all of that, and then, you know, once it came out, like things changed a little bit. So but not by accident, hard work, I think, on a lot of their part, and they weren't gonna put their money somewhere where they weren't gonna get what they wanted. So
Perfect. Well, that's it what we have for questions. Unless there's anything else, let me just see in one of the chats. Yeah. But, you know, long story short, thank you folks for attending. Is there anything else either of my co-panelists would also like to add?
Thank you all for showing up.
yeah, thanks for being here and joining us today in our social media. Wonderful. Bring everybody together.
Yeah. So thank you, folks. Our contact information is on the last slide. We will be putting this up on Native American Lifeline's YouTube account. Please, you know, continue to follow us for more content. We're doing our best to post more and give folks more information. If people are interested in any specific content, please let us know. But we hope that everybody out there has a lovely evening and also a safe one. Take care.
Great job, guys.
Thank you guys very much for the support.
Yeah.